Hey, what's up, all you 40K fanatics? It's me, Casey, again, back in the Grimdark Garage once again to fulfill my role as the lore master of 40K fanatics. Today, we're going to be talking about the Dark Angels, the very first legion of the Emperor, the first Space Marine legion he saw fit to create, the ones who even gave the name Angels of Death to follow the Space Marines in the future. So, let's get into it. The Dark Angels. Founded in the First Legion during the end days of the Unification Wars on Terra, they used the gene seed of their primarch, Lionel Johnson, who they would later go on to meet in the days of the Great Crusade. The Dark Angels were known as the most efficient, ruthless, and single minded hunters and killers of the Emperor. Not only did they lead the charge in the early days of the Great Crusade, they also were gifted many dark age of technology and golden age of technology, ships, fleet, weapons, you name it. They got a lot of it. Other factions were gifted some things, but whereas those chapters, legions, however what you want to say it, were gifted a few ships here or there, the Dark Angels were gifted a whole fleet of these incredible ships. And that's just the start of it. They went on to the Great Crusade, plowing ahead on every expeditionary fleet, bringing multiple planets into compliant, and teaching other Space Marines how to, well, be Space Marines. Eventually, they would slow down, and other Space Marines would find their way or be reunited in their primarchs, and the Dark Angels would eventually, in turn, meet up with theirs. In those days, though, the Dark Angels were spread very thin on the dark fringes of the galaxy and taking on lethal missions of the expeditionary fleets far from the light of Terra on the battlefront, where they would hunt and kill the monsters in the dark that hunted and tracked the citizens of the Imperium. Eventually, the Dark Angels would meet up with their Primarch, Lionel Johnson, who would travel the span of the Milky Way galaxy on the very fringes of the Imperium to reunite his lost sons and bring them back into the fold. Eventually, they were reorganized using not only the organization of the Terran veterans that inhabited the Dark Angels, but also the Caliban Knights who would come from Caliban. The Lion restructured the entire Legion in a way that both ways would work and utilized their single minded combat effectiveness more efficiently. They would go on to win many battles and face many foes throughout the Milky Way galaxy during the Great Crusade. One of note was the Rongdon during the Rongdon Xenocides. I will one day make a much more vivid YouTube video about this, but for now, let's just. Eventually, the Primarch known as Horus would lead a Horus heresy in his great hissy fit and take half the Primarchs and their legions in one big battle against all of the loyalist Primarchs and the Imperium. Lionel Johnson would lead the Dark Angels against them, trying to catch up and being too spread out, had a hard time figuring out how he could get back to Terra and fight Horus and stop the heresy from happening. Unfortunately, during these days, the Lion was slowed due to the size of his legion and the spreading thin of his forces. So he had to face combat after combat with Conrad Kurz. Travel was slow because of all the warp storms known as the Ruin Storm that had threatened all of the Imperium. He would have to deal with Gilliman and Sanguinius at no end in the Imperium Secundus, and he constantly have to fight his brother Conrad Kurz. Eventually, after Horus went full craziness against the Emperor, and the Emperor ended up on the universe's biggest life support system, he would go on to try to get back to his homeworld of Caliban, where he had sent his second in command, Luther, and a good portion of his Dark Angels Space Marines to get new recruits and consolidate their forces. He would then find that Luther had been corrupted by chaos and turned into a chaos champion and taken all of his Dark Angels under his command in sway. The lion, being a swift and knowledgeable and courteous primarch, would say, I forgive you, brother. Not. He bombed his own planet and attacked all of the fallen dark angels that inhabited the planet. Eventually, the planet would give out and it would blow up. The only thing surviving was his home fortress on the world because of the most powerful shields they had. The lion and all of the fallen angels, besides Luther, would get cast into the warp, never to be seen again, throughout space and time. The dark angels found Luther babbling about the lion, his battle, and everything that had occurred. A crazy, dribbling, nonsense psycho. So they froze him and decided that they would hunt the fallen throughout the universe no matter what. This being a crazy task because of not knowing how many exactly turned traitor, how many had been recruited in the process. Also, being cast into the warp, they weren't just thrown across the universe, they were thrown across time as well, some not even reappearing until thousands of years later. Eventually, we get to the 40K setting as we have it now. The Dark Angels are suspicious of just about anyone because of their guilt of the traitors that had followed Luther into the heresy. They hunt the fallen Dark Angels that would become known as the Fallen, and the Dark Angels and also their successor chapters would go on to name themselves the Unforgiven. It is a deep, dark secret, even within the ranks of the Dark Angels, only being known by the leadership, also known as the Inner Circle, about the fallen angels. They hunt any sniff of clue or hint that the fallen angels have been in a location. They drop everything they are doing currently at the time and they go straight wherever they are needed to find these fallen angels so they can torture them, beat them, and get them to repent for their past sins, hopefully gaining more information on how to find more of the fallen. It is a disturbing fate and painful one if a fallen angel is ever found by his younger brothers, the Dark Angels. In the current setting, the Dark Angels are now taking their single mindedness that they have always been famous for to an extreme. The 10,000 years have weighed on this very heavily, whereas they would hunt their quarry to no end until they stopped. For the last 10,000 years, it has made them paranoid, suspicious, and a little bit crazy, if I'm not lying. They suspected Gilliman when he came back. They suspect other chapters, other Space Marines, other Imperial factions. They will go to no crazy length that you could ever possibly think of just to keep the secret of their hidden past and the fallen. They've killed inquisitors, they've ran from battle zones. Some successor chapters have even been declared renegade because they refuse to talk about the reason why they left a battle zone or why they up and moved to a sector they weren't even supposed to be into. The Dark Angels are now sullen, quiet, and suspicious. Keeping to their nightly orders and the structures laid down by their Primarch the Lion, they have now spread across the universe and tried to fight the Emperor's wars and kill the beasts that threaten the Imperium's borders wherever they may be, hoping that one day it would lead them to their fallen brethren. Thanks for listening, everybody. That's been the Dark Angels and their Primarch Lionel Johnson. I'll be doing the Third Legion next time. So, it's been Casey, straight from the Grimdark Garage. If you haven't yet, like, share, subscribe, go to my podcast, go to the channel, tell your friends, tell your family, go to my Twitter, have a shout, and thanks for listening. See ya.